Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. It is so exciting that we have managed to make it through 6 weeks of our, is it 7 weeks? 7 weeks of our lecture series already. And I'm still learning new and different topics on each of the different things that we have. And it's amazing. And being able to take that chance to talk a little bit about some unknown history that we don't think much about in terms of military history. Very rarely do we even consider Alaska as part of the United States at that point, because she wasn't a state yet. But her role was key to the defense of the United States. And there was very interesting things that went on there that we will be talking about this evening. And so we are very excited to have Professor John Heaton here with us this evening to talk. But before we start any program here at the USS Silversides, we always begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you are able, please stand while we say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you to all of you for coming out, whether you were in person or you were on Zoom. We're very excited to have you here. And I was very impressed with the presentation that Don and Teresa did last week. As I was saying earlier, we don't often talk enough about our own things that we have here in Muskegon and our own ability to talk about our own artifacts that we have. Tonight, at the end of this presentation, Teresa will come back and she will talk about the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter McLean. She is our other vessel here in Muskegon. And Teresa will go through a shortened version of its history. Excuse me, when we do talk a lot about her, we usually start about her earlier times in Prohibition and go all the way up until the time that she was decommissioned. But tonight we're going to make that very small, and we're just going to talk about that short, brief window of time where we are just talking about her time during World War II. And so we are very excited to have that conversation as well. So what we will be doing this evening is Dr. Heaton will be presenting on World War II in Alaska. Then Teresa will present on our Coast Guard Cutter McLean. And if there's any questions going on, please let us know. We will answer and ask and answer those for you. And thank you all for coming out. As you know, here at the USS Silversides, our mission is simple. It's to honor the veteran. And everything that we do here is always to give honor to those that gave so much and some that gave it all for the United States. And we appreciate everything and everyone that have served our country for that. With that, we have some wonderful sponsors. Our series sponsor is the Fred Birch Senior Foundation out of Holland, and they are a premier sponsor. For those of you that are here with me consistently, you know how much we appreciate them. Their foundation was founded based on that the best way to serve your country is through service to it, whether it be at the state, federal, or local level. And the Birch family was one of those people that have done that throughout many generations, with many generations of active military personnel, as well as when they came back to civilian life, them promoting community service in their own neighborhoods. And we appreciate them for that. We are also happy to have as our media sponsor, Blue Lake Public Radio. Again, another wonderful organization that treats our community very well and is one of those gems that we have right here. We're looking forward to always telling the story of the veterans and telling the stories that affected their lives and telling what it is that they did in order to make our country what it is and to save the world for democracy during World War II and all the subsequent conflicts that there has been. So we're very much looking forward to tonight's presentation. Next week's presentation will be done in the same manner. We will be zooming into the theater, and that presentation will be about the Seabees, another group that did so much, but seldom, if ever, gets any type of recognition. And we are so happy to give them just that little bit of attention and that little bit of thank you for all that they did. So next week's topic will be the Sea service in the Pacific during World War II. And is there any questions before we move onward with our lecture this evening? Well, thank you very much. And I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. He seems in the little corner here of the screen. In order for me to make him bigger, I would have to move all the way back to the back of the room. So he is here. We're very excited that you're here. He is a wonderful instructor, teaching many people from our own community, as well as he actually has a student here from the Muskegon area. And we're very excited that strange how small worlds can connect like that. And from the chance to be able to hear Alaskan history from a person that teaches in Alaska at the university there, and to hear so many of the stories that we don't know about, and so many of the things that our history books can never possibly go into all the great detail. And the more that I study World War II history, the more I feel like I don't know anything. Because every time you turn a page in a book, you find out something new and something different. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Heaton. Thank you.
Thanks, Peg. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be, where am I? in Michigan virtually. I don't want to disappoint anybody, but I'm actually living in Huntsville, Alabama now. I lived in Fairbanks from 2000 to 2020, and then because of the pandemic was able to get a telecommuting contract. So I continue to teach students in Fairbanks from Alabama. It is a crazy new world that we live in. Tonight, I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk with y'all tonight. So notice how I threw that y'all in. I'm not from the South, but I'm picking up on it. My main purpose is to provide an overview of World War II activity in Alaska. We're only going to be scratching the surface. There is a surprising amount of history, and I find it fascinating. There's unexpected things that I have discovered in putting together this lecture for you tonight. So to quote an old Jerry Reed song, we got a long ways to go and a short time to get there, so I'm going to get moving. I'm going to start with geography and climate, because the only way we can understand the history in Alaska is to understand the impact of that. So most Americans, when they think of Alaska in terms of a mental map, this is the map that people have grown up with, right? Alaska is just off the coast of California and Baja. It doesn't convey the right picture. This is a better way to consider Alaska in the context of the United States needing to fortify and defend it. That's the scale that we're talking about. Alaska, if you overlay the map of Alaska on top of the United States, as you can see, it stretches from coast to coast. About 586,000 square miles, 17% of the total area of the United States. The shoreline is about 47,000 miles. If you're measuring all of the contours, that is a lot of shoreline to try to protect. Let's see, let's go a topographic map. One of the problems that the United States faces is that, in the 1930s, there hasn't been much development in Alaska. There is not much in the way of a communication and transportation network that has been developed. If you look at the topography, it's very difficult to get through the mountains into the interior. There are a few rivers, such as the Yukon, that were historically used to get access into the interior. But transportation is a major obstacle for the government and for the military as it prepares for war. There is a railroad, about a 500-mile long railroad that goes from Seward. If I move my cursor, does it show up on
Yes.
your screen?
Yes,
Okay,
it's
so Seward's kind of in this area, and the railroad goes through the Anchorage area and up to Fairbanks up here. And then there is a road from Valdez that runs up to Fairbanks as well, about a 386-mile road, but that's really the extent of any kind of developed transportation network by 1940. The population is mainly spread out throughout the territory in small native villages. There is a significant white population. So Fairbanks has about 3,500 people. Again, Fairbanks is up here in the interior, kind of the heart of Alaska. Anchorage down here has about 3,000 people, and Juneau in the southeast area has a population of just under 6,000. Military presence in Alaska by the late 1930s is a 400-man barracks here, Chilkoot Barracks in Skagway, and that's a sort of a holdover, I don't know, maybe a legacy force from the gold rush at the turn of the century. So there's really not much there in the way of a military presence into the late 1930s. So there are a couple of people that are trying to change that during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Our first character, fascinating guy, is Colonel William Billy Mitchell. Mitchell had been an officer during World War I. By the end of that conflict, he was in command of all of the air combat units in France. After the war, he became deputy director of the Air Service, and he began to advocate very strongly for an increased military expenditure investment in air power. He thought that air power would be the deciding factor of war in the future. He particularly was passionate about the ability of bombers to sink battleships. And he organized a series of tests to prove this point. He constantly harassed the military brass, trying to get them to listen to him and to begin to make that investment. He antagonized so many leaders, administrative leaders in the Army, that in 1925, they returned his appointment as brigadier general to a permanent rank of colonel because of what they said was insubordination. Later in the year, he actually was court-martialed for insubordination because he publicly accused the Army and Navy leaders of, quote, an almost treasonable administration of the national defense. He was upset because they continued to invest in battleships instead of in aircraft carriers. He resigned from service shortly after that. He wrote an influential, it didn't get a lot of readership, but those that did read it were influenced by it, a paper titled America, Air Power and the Pacific. In essence, he's outlining what will eventually become America's approach to the use of Alaska in its air power for the next 65 years. I don't know if you in the audience are familiar with a naval strategist in the late 19th century, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He wrote a book, The Influence of Sea Power on History, that in some ways, Billy Mitchell's publication was similar to Mahan's book. And Mahan basically was able to influence a complete transformation of American naval power. And in many ways, Mitchell will be responsible for the modernization of use of air power in the American military and the shift from battleship focus to aircraft carrier focus. Anyway, one of the things that Mitchell pointed out in this paper was that, quote, outside of the United States proper, Alaska is our most important point with regard to our protection against Asia. The distance to Hawaii from Alaska is only 1,300 miles as compared to 2,000 miles from our Pacific coast. Alaska is within striking distance of any place we want to approach in Asia, either commercially or in a military way. So he is sort of forced out of the military. He will continue to advocate as a civilian, but his colleague, Colonel Henry Hap Arnold, will sort of pick up that torch within the military and continue to lobby for increased expenditure on the Army Air Corps and continue to push for more aircraft carriers. His nickname was Hap, and Hap Arnold is famous in Alaska for his flight in 1934. He led 10 B-10 bombers on a flight from Washington, D.C. to Fairbanks to help build the case for more airfields in Alaska and to prove that it could be done without needing to stop in Canada. Shortly after that, a Democratic representative from Florida, James Wilcox, introduced a bill that would provide finances to build airfields in Alaska and in other places in the United States. And Mitchell publicly supported this bill, and he gave perhaps at least to Alaskans, his most famous statement about air power. And he said in his support of this bill that Alaska is the most central place in the world for aircraft, and that is true of Europe, Asia, or North America. I believe in the future, he who holds Alaska will hold the world. And I think it's the most strategic place in the world. Okay, maybe hyperbole. Alaskans love that statement, but he is making a point of the strategic location of this territory. Fortification of Alaska is slowed in the 1930s, in part because in 1922, the Washington Naval Disarmament Treaty was signed, which was, it was an agreement to limit the size of navies between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan. And as part of the agreement, as an inducement to get the Japanese to sign, the United States agreed not to fortify the Aleutian Islands, and that was enough to bring Japan on board to sign the treaty. Well, during the mid-1930s, Japan pulled out of that agreement, and they began to fortify in the Kuril Islands, and this led the United States to begin plans to finally fortify the Aleutians. And there was a naval intelligence report that suggested that naval bases should be built in Sitka, in Kodiak, and at Dutch Harbor. Congress finally will authorize remilitarization of Alaska in 1940. The Navy wanted those 3 bases to be built, in part because they weren't going to assign ships of the line to this region, this part of the Pacific. They were going to have smaller ships there, but they did want these bases so that they could fly reconnaissance missions to keep surveillance on the approaches to Alaska. The Army wanted bases to be built because it was going to be their responsibility to defend this territory from both naval and air attack. In the pre-war years, it was difficult for military officials to really conceive of the important significance of Alaska. They weren't thinking about Alaska as a strategic location. Even after the German invasion of Poland in 1939, still there was only that 400-man garrison in Chilkat. The Navy was continuing to ignore Alaska. In 1939, it had a small seaplane base here in Sitka, had direction finder stations at Soapstone Point and in Prince William Sound. The only military establishments in the Aleutian chain at this time was a small radio station, Coast Guard station here at Dutch Harbor. Finally, we start to see civilian contractors arriving to begin to build those 3 naval bases at Sitka, Kodiak, and Dutch Harbor. And part of this process begins because the War Department is rethinking its strategy. It's rethinking its strategy in the North, in part because of improvements in airplane technology. Airplanes are increasingly seen as a potential threat. Relations between the Japanese and the United States have deteriorated. There's growing strain in this relationship. And because the Navy was building new air and submarine bases in these 3 locations, it was the Army's responsibility to provide local protection. Still, because of what's going on around the world by 1940, the United States, it has a lot of it has much to think about in terms of strategy, in terms of where to put limited resources. It's not just Alaska that needs reinforcement. And Alaska continues to be an afterthought. It's still not seen as a critical area. The environment, the climate, remote location, the geographical barriers, geological barriers, lack of an internal transportation system. I mean, Alaska may well have been an island. It was so far away. The only way to supply Alaska was by ship. As you know, there is no road at this point. Finally, in September, Captain Benjamin Talley becomes the engineer in charge of constructing a field at Yakutat here in Southeast, an airfield. After that project, he is sent to Fort Richardson, which is an Army post outside of Anchorage, and he's tasked with building Elmendorf Field, which would then be attached to Fort Richardson. He's given a 2-year timetable. In his mind, that is too long. He believes that the United States will be at war and that this will be a critical military base. And so he pushes really hard to get the materials that he needs. It's hard to find enough cement. They're building fortifications all around the country, and so materials are hard to come by. He gets there in the middle of the winter. How much cement can you pour when it's 20 below in Anchorage? Well, he comes up with methods to clear the land, jackhammers to break through the frozen ground. They come up with a process to heat the cement and keep it warm while it's mixing. And then they pour the cement and they keep the cement heated with steam boilers after it's poured so it can dry. So it comes up with all of these, innovative ways to get the job done. And shortly after that expansion at Fort Richardson, a similar expansion goes on at Ladd Field in Fort Wainwright, which is just right next to Fairbanks. And then, so the expansion at Ladd, which is the cold weather testing proving station for the Air Force, that's occurring in 1941. And then, of course, in December, we have the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. And this will spur a real sense of urgency and activity all along the West Coast, but also in Alaska. This surprise attack, of course, destroys about 40% of the US Pacific Fleet's capacity. Military personnel in Alaska hear about this attack several days later from a civilian radio station operator in Fairbanks. That's how bad the communication system is in Alaska. There's kind of a panic in Alaska. Military personnel evacuate their families. They evacuate the families of civilian contractors and their employees. There's a blackout ordered on coastal cities. The mayor of Juneau builds a tent city outside of Juneau in case Juneau gets attacked. It's sort of this knee-jerk reaction And it doesn't take too long for territorial officials to realize that it's really, this is too little. It's not going to solve the problem, and that much more work needs to be done. Tens of thousands of military personnel and civilian workers quickly show up in Alaska to begin to construct a military defense. There's several things that happen as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, so I'll go quickly through them. First thing, of course, most people are familiar with Executive Order 9066. This leads to the internment of Japanese American citizens as well as citizens of Japan who are living in America. About 117,000 of these people are interned in camps throughout the West. 104 of these internees came from Alaska. They were ordered to gather at shipping points in Anchorage and Juneau, and they ended up being transported to a camp in New Mexico. Many of them lose property, and many of them do not return to Alaska after the war. Fortification continues in earnest after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Between 1940 and 1943, there are scores of military bases constructed throughout the territory. By the end of the war, in 1945, there are 300 new military facilities that have been constructed. So Alaska does become fortified quite rapidly. So in early 1942, there are about 21,000 Army personnel and 13,000 Navy personnel that have been sent to Alaska. The Alaska National Guard is actually ordered down to Washington State to help to defend the state of Washington. This leaves the territory without a home guard. So the territorial governor, Ernest Greening, decides to organize what comes to be called the Alaska Territorial Guard. And I don't know if you guys can get the full view there of Major Marvin Muktuk Marston. He is the man, he's an Army Air Corps major. And oh, by the way, his nickname Muktuk is frozen whale skin and blubber, which is a traditional native food in Alaska. He is tasked with organizing the Guard along the Bering Sea and the Arctic coast. This next map shows, it's a map of native villages and the number of volunteers from each of these villages. Marston trekked across the territory, across the tundra, often by dog sled in the winter, spreading the word, organizing volunteer groups, training the troops. They came to be known as the Eskimo Scouts, and they were they were supplied with surplus World War I weapons and equipment. About 6,300 Alaska Natives from 107 communities aged 12 to 80 volunteered to serve without pay in the Territorial Guard during the war. They became the United States military's eyes and ears along the 6,600-mile coastline. Marston wrote that his volunteers were enthusiastic and capable militiamen who responded unanimously and patriotically to the Japanese threat. They were instrumental in keeping watch on the coast, and they also shot down several incendiary balloons, balloon bombs, I guess you could describe them, that the Japanese set loose to try to spread fear and terror throughout the territory. And if you're interested in Marston's exploits and the exploits of his Territorial Guard, he did write a book. It's called Men of the Tundra, Alaska Eskimos at War. Again, we're just barely scratching the surface, and there's so many of these colorful, fascinating characters. Okay, another important impact of the bombing of Pearl Harbor was now the construction of a highway through Canada. The Alaska Highway finally becomes a reality. The need for this highway had been argued for many years, Canadian government officials had resisted pressures from the United States, especially from Alaskans. They didn't think it was necessary. In fact, well, the American military didn't think it was necessary either. They had been supplying Alaska with the Navy and in fact, they would continue to supply Alaska with the Navy throughout the war. The only Canadians that wanted this road were officials in British Columbia, because they hoped that that road would help them to develop some of the resources in the northern part of the province. Anyway, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, it became clear that it was necessary to build this road, even if it was going to be just a pioneering road, just in case it would be necessary. The United States military didn't want to commit resources to this road. They begrudgingly committed some resources. They ended up sending regiments of African-American engineers because they didn't think that African-Americans were critical to the war effort. So they were sort of expendable. They could be used on a project like this that wasn't a high priority for the military. Because the military was segregated at the time, these regiments of engineer soldiers were led by white officers. What they did is just absolutely amazing. If any of you have ever driven this highway, it goes on and on forever. I've driven it 3 times. It's the only time in my life I ever felt like I was really out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, living in Fairbanks, it's a relatively developed city with an international airport and rail links and highways. But man, there's just, to this day, there's not much along this highway. And especially if you look at that picture of the bulldozer, to me, that's what it feels like. And can imagine building this road in 9 months in really tough environmental conditions, a 2,500-mile long road. It really is an amazing engineering feat that was accomplished. Now, it doesn't really serve to supply Alaska, but it does become actually a very crucial and necessary road for the Alaska-Siberian staging route. And that's the next topic that I want to gloss here. Now, if you look at that blue highway through Canada, that's essentially the path that the Alaska Highway follows. The arrows in the United States are the flight patterns from airplane manufacturing plants. Airplanes were staged at Great Falls. These are the airplanes that were provided through the Lend-Lease program that Franklin Delano Roosevelt organized in 1941 to supply the Soviet Union with the necessary equipment to meet the onslaught of Operation Barbarossa, which was unleashed on them by the Germans in September of 1942. So the planes were flown by women Air Force service pilots from the factories to Great Falls, and from Great Falls, Army Air Corps pilots then flew along the Alaska Highway, and a series of landing fields were either constructed or improved along the way. You can see the Grand Prairie, Fort St. John, Fort Nelson, Watson Lake. These are all part of this plan to send planes to the Soviet Union. It's an incredibly important program in terms of the war in Europe. Now, if anybody knows anything about Alaska, they probably know during World War II, they know that Alaska was attacked at Dutch Harbor and that 2 Aleutian Islands were occupied by the Japanese. They maybe know a little bit about the program to send planes from the United States to the Soviet Union. But let me emphasize how crucial these planes became. Within 2 weeks of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in it's June 1941 when they attack the Soviet Union, and within 2 weeks they have destroyed about 5,500 Soviet Union planes, either in the air or on the ground, and this is roughly half of Soviet air power. So over the course of several years, just under 8,000 American fighters and bombers are supplied to the Soviet Union, with Fairbanks as sort of the midpoint where, so American pilots would fly these planes to Fairbanks, they'd be staged there, and then Soviet pilots would take the planes and then fly from Fairbanks into the Soviet Union. It's still, you know, it's a hazardous flight still from Great Falls to Fairbanks. And the way that the Army organized the transfer of these planes was to have usually a C-47 transport mothership kind of guiding the planes that are traveling in formation. And it was very rare for one of these C-47s to show up in Fairbanks with the formation intact. Weather was often a problem. These planes didn't have very sophisticated navigational systems. Pilots either got lost or were forced to land because of technical problems, mechanical problems, weather. About 1 in 60 didn't make it, crashed along the way. 15 pilots lost their lives moving these planes from Great Falls to Fairbanks. And when they did go down, those that survived tended to go down near this highway so that they could get help relatively easily, and it was easy to find them. Hap Arnold saw how much safer the route had become. He was the one that flew that first long flight of B-10s in 1934. And he said that never in the history of aviation has a road been so important to airmen. All right. Well, here's where things get really dangerous and fascinating. In the first week of June 1942, Japanese bombers will attack at Dutch Harbor. The raid is cover for a planned invasion of Attu, Kiska, and Adak. Let's see if I got a map of those. Yeah, there we go. Adak, Kiska, Attu. It's also an effort to create a diversion to try to draw off. Midway Island is about 1,000 miles from Dutch Harbor, almost due south. And the Japanese strategy is to seize the airfields at Midway and then, you know, be able to be that much closer to threaten the United States, but also to push the United States back even further in the Pacific. Anyway, so the variety of reasons for a carrier group with 2 aircraft carriers, a Japanese carrier group, to be steaming towards the Aleutians. And at 5:40 in the morning on June 3rd, 1942, US radar at Dutch Harbor picked up the attack force of Japanese planes about 10 miles out at 10,000 feet. They were flying through a storm. When they came close to the harbor, Dutch Harbor, the storm broke. It was like they were in the eye of the storm, and it was perfect timing for the Japanese. They got a lucky break because they didn't have very much intelligence. They really didn't know what they would find when they got there. And so in some ways they were, you know, figuratively flying blind on this bombing mission. So they had really good luck. The Americans were able to, you know, they sounded general quarters. They moved really quickly. They were able to get their anti-aircraft guns up and aimed in the right location. And so by the time the Japanese were coming down, they were already firing off rounds to, to find their range. The machine gunners had manned their stations on the rooftops at Fort Mears. And where did my other one go? There it is. Sorry. You can see the men in the trenches here. This is Dutch Harbor. They were able to get into the trenches. They didn't know what, if there was going to be an attempted landing as well, but everybody was in position by the time that the attack started. One mail plane was able to get airborne, and a PBY also got airborne just as the Dutch Harbor radioed that they were about to be bombed by Japanese planes. At Cold Bay, over here on the Alaska Peninsula, it's about 180 miles away. P-40s were scrambled within a few minutes. They got word that Dutch Harbor was under attack. Right here at Umnak, just 40 miles away, they never heard. They didn't get the message. They didn't scramble their fighters. Again, I want to highlight the problems of communication and just the lack of an infrastructure in Alaska. So they probably could have gotten there in time to have helped out, but they never got word. Okay, so the Japanese do have luck on their side. They will lose one plane. That PBY that was able to get airborne was able to catch a zero unaware, flew up underneath, and the gunners in the PBY opened fire, and they were able to bring one zero down, and then they headed up a steep canyon that the other zeros couldn't follow. So the name of the pilot is Ensign Hildebrand. And so I guess, if you're looking for a hero of the first day at Dutch Harbor, maybe he's your guy. Okay, well, so lots of smoke, lots of apparent success, but really not much damage. 25 servicemen were killed when a barracks was hit at Dutch Harbor, and about 25 were wounded. But none of the ships were hit in the harbor. So lots of smoke, lots of noise, lots of explosions, but not too much damage. That first wave starts heading back to their aircraft carriers, and a second wave is on its way. The second wave never finds the target. The storm is just too intense. And I should mention that this area, the Aleutian Island, is famous for the storms. It's the nickname of this part of the Pacific is Cradle of the Storms. You've got a very warm, humid air and Pacific current coming up from the equator, and it's meeting a very dry and cold air mass that comes down from Siberia and the Arctic, and the result is it generates just storm after storm. There's maybe 10 clear days a year in this part of the Pacific. There's no dry season. It's the cradle of the storms, and weather plays a very significant role in this campaign. It's sort of the first enemy that both sides have to contend with. So the second wave, they never find Dutch Harbor, and they are forced to turn back. All of them, with the exception of four Japanese Zeros, are attacked by 21 P-40s. They don't know where they came from. The Japanese are unaware of this air base at Umnak that's so close to Dutch Harbor. The United States sends out recon flights. They're trying to figure out where the Japanese carriers are. One plane is able to spot the fleet about 200 miles south of Dutch Harbor, but they get shot down. Only 3 survive. They are picked up by a Japanese ship, a Japanese cruiser, and interrogated, but they're able to play dumb, and the Japanese still can't figure out. They're trying to figure out where this air base is, this unexpected air base. Another plane discovers the carrier group, radios back its location, but the message is not received. It's garbled. This plane is crippled by one of the Japanese vessels. It makes it about halfway back to its base before it has to ditch in the sea, but it is picked up by the USS Nemaha. The skipper of that ship is under orders to maintain radio silence, so it takes 3 days for him to report back, and by then it's too late. Another crew goes up, another series of flights to try to find this carrier group, and finally on June 4th, they're able to find it and radio back, and planes are scrambled to try to do some damage on these aircraft carriers. Unfortunately, they're not able to manage a coordinated attack. Only a few of these ships are able to find the Japanese fleet because the weather is so bad. They drop a few bombs, a few planes are lost, but no damage on the Japanese fleet, carrier fleet. Weather's bad, it's affecting everybody. Well, June 4th marks the beginning of the Battle of Midway. It's also the second day of the battle for Dutch Harbor, of the attack on Dutch Harbor. The Japanese Admiral Kakuta has sent a third wave to bomb Dutch Harbor. And while that wave is out, he gets orders from Admiral Yamamoto to bring his carrier task force down to help the Japanese with the Battle of Midway, because things are going so badly for Yamamoto's large carrier group. So Kakuta is kind of stuck. He can't leave without his pilots coming back. Finally, at 4 p.m., that third wave of Japanese planes hits Dutch Harbor. This time, the Americans were waiting for them. The harbor had been cleared of the ships. Lots of bombs going on, being dropped. A wing of the hospital base is hit. Oil tanks are hit. Storage tanks are hit. 750,000 gallons of fuel goes off in a massive explosion. And that explosion was so loud that 40 miles away, the pilots in Umnak hear the explosion and they realize that there's another attack, and they scramble. So P-40 Warhawks are in the air, but within 20 minutes, the bombing is over. Another 18 have been killed, 25 wounded. The pilots from Umnak engage. There are dogfights. Both sides lose a few planes. 1-0 is brought down with no damage. I think it was the oil line got hit. It forces the pilot to land. He lands with the plane intact, and the United States captures its first 0 intact. They will ship that 0 to the lower 48 for military engineers to study. And it's sort of, some historians have said this marks the beginning of the end of the Zero's dominance in the Pacific theater. Okay. Yamamoto has lost 4 carriers. It's a crushing defeat at Midway. He needs a victory in the Aleutians to sort of lessen the sting of his disaster. So he tells Kakuta to turn around and head back to the Aleutians and to stay focused on invading at Attu and Kiska. So we turn our attention to those invasions. June 7th, Japanese land first on Kiska with about 1,250 soldiers. There are only 10 Americans manning a radio station. They try to escape. They're captured. Kiska is taken with no resistance. Attu is a little bit more complicated. So Kiska is this island here. Attu is here. It's a little bit more complicated to take Attu. The weather was bad. They have they land on 2 sides of the island. One landing group gets lost. They almost starve before they find their way. Finally, they link up. There are 42 Aleuts, villagers living on Attu. They're captured. And there are two American radio operators, a husband and wife team, Mr. and Mrs. Foster Jones. They're captured. Mr. Jones escapes. They recapture him. He dies he dies on the island at the hands of the Japanese. All the survivors of this invasion are shipped off to Ataro City, and they spend the war on sorry, I don't speak Japanese, Hokkaido. 17 of them will die in captivity during the war. So if you look at this map, you see sort of the extent of the Japanese Empire by mid-1942. You can see the strategic location of these islands for both the Japanese and the Americans. And so now the Americans, they spend the next several days trying to figure out where is that Japanese carrier group? What are they up to? It takes several days for them to figure out that Attu and Kiska have been taken. And so once they figure that out, they begin a bombing campaign to try to dislodge the Japanese before they can get settled in and fortify their positions. But it's going to be a failed effort, and it's going to take more than a year to dislodge the Japanese from these islands. So the Americans have to figure out what is our battle plan here now. It's sort of an embarrassment. It's a potential morale problem for the rest of the United States. There's the West Coast especially is living in fear, and the Americans have to figure out very quickly what the strategy is going to be. And what they decide is that for the next 6 months, that the Army Air Corps will continue a bombing campaign to harass the Japanese, keep the pressure on them, keep them off balance, keep them uncertain, always on the defensive, while the United States can prepare an invasion force to force the Japanese off these islands. It's important to remember that the United States is engaged at war in several other parts of the world, and the main strategy is Europe first, then Japan. So in some ways, it's sort of a holding pattern. We're gonna keep the Japanese at bay while we try to take care of problems elsewhere in the world, and we build up our forces. So that's the strategy for the next 6 months. The retaliatory campaign that occurs in the Pacific starts at Attu. It's 2 months. The campaign against Attu starts 2 months before the famous Battle of Guadalcanal. This campaign is weak, it's uncertain, it's plagued with misfortune, plenty of mistakes, but it is a start. And I want to plug the book by Brian Garfield. I'm going to hold that up. 1,000 Mile War. It's a great book. I got a lot of my information from Brian Garfield, and his argument is that it's a weak, uncertain campaign, but it's a start. And more than that, he calls it a rehearsal. It's a rehearsal for the island hopping campaign that begins in earnest in the South Pacific. The part of the Pacific campaign that most people are familiar with, the testing ground, the proving ground, is in the battle for Attu and for Kiska. All right, finally in February 1943, the Navy will begin a blockade using 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. So they blockade the approach to Attu and Kiska to dissuade the Japanese from resupply. So they're cutting the supply line. They're going to try to starve the Japanese out, or at least prevent resupply, as they prepare for an invasion of Attu first and then Kiska. Finally, on May 11th, 1943, Task Force 51, 32 ships, an invasion force of about 15,000 Army and Navy personnel. And we get the invasion of Attu, which was defended by just over 2,600 Japanese soldiers. The Japanese know they don't have a chance. They're running out of supplies. there's no help that's going to get to them. And so they decide to evacuate their post close to the coastline, and they move up it's a volcano. They move up to high ground and wait for the inevitable, but they're not going to give up without a fight, and they are going to fight according to the samurai code of Bushido. So finally, on May 11th, we have the first American amphibious island landing since the Cuban campaign in 1898. The beaches are secured by early evening without firing a shot. It's eerily quiet. There's a fog that has come down, so it's shrouding the mountains. They can't see the Japanese positions, but the Japanese can peer down through the fog and they see what the Americans are doing. The fighting at Attu is fierce. It's difficult. By day 7, Americans had suffered 1,100 casualties. 500 of these are exposure cases. There are only 2,000 Japanese fighting at this point, and it takes about 8-9 days for the Americans to almost close a circle around the Japanese force. They land a second group on the other side of the island, and they're sort of working up the backside of the mountain. By Friday, May 28th, the Japanese have been pushed down from the high ground, so the Americans have finally captured the high ground. The Japanese are down to 800 men who are capable of fighting, and they've got 600 wounded. No hope for the Japanese garrison on Attu, but Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki was going to fight on till the end. He only had a few days of supplies left, and so he decided to do a banzai charge in the middle of the night. Well, it's about 4 in the morning when he decides to unleash this charge. Now, according to Brian Garfield, this is the first banzai charge of World War II, and it happens in Alaska. The hope for the Japanese is to find that weak point in the American line, catch them by surprise, break through, grab the artillery, train it on the Americans, and force them back down the mountain, and maybe even get a hold of American supplies so they can continue the fight. They almost succeed. They break through the initial American line. A group of engineers is sort of haphazardly thrown together on a ridge line to hold off with rifles and grenades, and they're finally able to hold off this banzai charge. 500 Japanese commit suicide with their hand grenades held to their chest. A few of the stragglers gather with Yamamoto, and they make one last valiant effort. I'm sorry, Yamasaki. I'm mixing Yamamoto and Yamasaki. Anyway, Yamasaki, you got to at least recognize the heroism of him and his men. He goes down to a 30 caliber bullet with a sword in hand, fighting to the very end. The occupation is over. The cost to liberate Attu, which is essentially a barren island, 3,829 casualties. 549 killed in action, 1,148 wounded, 1,200 severe cold injuries, 614 to disease, 318 other casualties. The casualty ratios were among the highest at Attu, the highest of any battles of the Pacific campaign. Attu is retaken at tremendous cost. Attu is a battle that will be studied by the military. So in many ways, I think Garfield was onto something when he called it a rehearsal for the island hopping campaign. And one of the things that was learned at Attu was that the invasion of Kiska needed to have a massive force. No more messing around. We're going in with a massive force. Unfortunately, well, I guess it's fortunate in some ways, but embarrassingly, the Japanese were able to get a rescue fleet of several ships to evacuate the 5,000 Japanese defenders of Kiska. 13 ships are able to get through this blockade. They evacuate without detection on July 28th. So they blow up anything that might be of use to the Americans. They set booby traps. They chalked insults in English on the walls of their abandoned quarters. And so they get out of there. Meanwhile, the Americans continue a bombing campaign on Kiska. On August 4th alone, 135 sorties dumped 304,000 pounds of explosives on a deserted island. D-Day was August 15. By August 18, the American forces realized that there's nobody there. They have retaken Kiska, but not before almost 100 men had died, lost to booby traps, friendly fire. A US destroyer struck a Japanese mine. 50 more were wounded. 130 got trench foot. For weeks, the Allies had bombed a deserted island. And for a week after that, they had deployed a force of 35,000 soldiers and sailors across a deserted island. This becomes known as the blunder of Kiska in the press. All right, we're almost done here. There's one last thing that I want to mention before I conclude. Another thing that you maybe haven't heard about Alaska during World War II is that shortly after that initial attack on Dutch Harbor, I forgot to mention two things I want to mention. After the attack on Dutch Harbor, a unit was put together by Colonel Lawrence Kastner. They were called Kastner's Cutthroats. It was an Alaska Scout Commando unit, a commando unit made up of Alaskans, people that knew the territory, knew the weather, and they helped to scout landing zones. They helped to scout airfields in the Aleutians. It's a another fascinating story that I just didn't have time to get to. I don't know why there isn't a movie on these guys. There should be. Anyway, now one more thing that you maybe haven't heard of. Sorry, I'm running out of time and I didn't get a lot of these pictures. Maybe I should let you take a look at these pictures real quick.
Very excited, so keep going.
Okay, good. One of my faults is I get very long-winded, and I was trying not to do that tonight. So these are photos from Attu, the landing. This photo right here, Japanese prisoner of war that was taken. You can see that just the human drama, the psychological trauma of this incredibly bloody campaign. So those are the images from Attu. This is a picture of the bombing of Kiska, trying to soften up Kiska. That's a ship that's smoking in Kiska Harbor, a Japanese vessel. And here was the last thing I wanted to talk about. After the bombing of the initial bombing of Dutch Harbor in June 1942, the United States military gathered up 800 Aleut natives that lived throughout the Aleutian Island chain to evacuate them from what had become a war zone. Remember that 42 were taken captive to Japan from Attu. So for the protection of these Aleut natives, they were relocated to Southeast Alaska to 4 abandoned canneries. Again, it's a story that many people don't know anything about. They didn't really have a choice. They didn't have time to gather up their belongings. Many of them, when they were finally allowed back at the end of the war, well, the first thing is they were not allowed back west of Alaska, where Dutch Harbor was located. So there are no more settlement. There are no more villages beyond Dutch Harbor. So many of them lost their homes, lost their belongings. Those that did get back to their homes oftentimes found that there was nothing left. The conditions in these temporary camps were deplorable. Very little privacy. The water supply was inadequate. Quarters lacked sanitation facilities, and there was very little in the way of medical care. So it was a it was a very devastating experience for many of these Aleuts. Now, I hesitated to put this picture here of these smiling native kids, but as you know, children are very resilient. They're going to find a way to make the best of things. And I thought it important to show that, you know, it's not like every single day was gloom and doom in these camps, but they didn't have a choice. They were held in pretty primitive conditions, and an Alaska historian, Stephen Haycox, I have the most respect for Stephen Haycox. He's one of the most important historians of Alaska, and he's made the argument that if these were white people, these conditions would not have been acceptable, and something would have been done. Anyway, there has been a lot written about the internment of Aleut Native villagers. And so if you're interested in that, it's an easy Google search for those studies. It's not until 1978 that President Jimmy Carter creates a commission to study not only the internment of Japanese Americans, but also the Aleuts. And finally, in 1988, there is an award made by Congress. Each survivor received $12,000, and a 6.4 million trust fund was set up to help Aleut communities, sort of as a reparation. All right, well, let's wrap this thing up because I'm basically out of time. You know, what is the legacy of World War II to Alaska's history? The economic impact of the war on the territory, it profoundly and permanently changes Alaska. During the course of the war, 300,000 different military personnel served in the territory. At the moment of, you know, the point of the largest population of servicemen, about 150,000 at one time were stationed in Alaska. This is at a time when the resident population was probably around 70,000. So it's significant that military personnel outnumbered the residents. The United States spent about $3 billion during the course of the war. There were significant improvements. Much equipment was left behind. The roads were important improvements. So it stimulates the economy. It creates an infrastructure that didn't exist. And the civilian population grows dramatically. There's 100,000 by the end of the war, and many of these veterans return to the territory. So that by 1959, in part as a result of sort of the economic stimulus of the war, enough people have moved there. The economy is beginning to grow to the extent that Alaska finally achieves statehood. Arguably, this wouldn't have happened without the World War II experience. Okay, so, you know, that's the impact, the legacy on Alaska. Let me just briefly run down. I've got like a grocery list of what I think are sort of the significant takeaways, things to remember about the impact of Alaska on America's World War II effort. So I want to emphasize the role of Billy Mitchell and Hap Arnold in arguing for the strategic role of Alaska and the modernization of air power and naval strategy. These are two guys that were focused on Alaska, and they helped to modernize the Air Force and the Navy. Alaska, of course, is serving a key part of the Pacific theater. Think of, you know, Attu and Kiska as a rehearsal for the strategy of island hopping that will eventually win the war in the Pacific. Native Alaskans play a significant role in defense of the homeland. The Alaska Highway, using mainly African-American soldiers, is this monumental feat of engineering. It makes the flyway, this route of the Lend-Lease Alaska-Siberian staging route, it makes it much more safe for pilots. And because of this Lend-Lease project, Alaska plays a key role in defeating the German invasion of the Soviet Union, and ultimately will lead to the defeat of Germany. What else? With the exception of Hawaii, Alaska is the only US territory to be attacked. Alaska is the only US territory to be occupied. The battle for attack on Dutch Harbor, because the Japanese decided to divert 2 carriers to Dutch Harbor and to the Aleutian invasion. They were 2 carriers short at the Battle of Midway, which many historians have argued is the turning point of the war in the Pacific. Let's see. Well, and Attu is one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. So there's really a lot going on up in Alaska, and I hope I have piqued your interest. I've really just scratched the surface. If you're interested, get this book by Brian Garfield, The 1,000-Mile War. He is a great writer. He actually is not a historian. He comes at this as a screenwriter. He was considered for the Pulitzer Prize. It is a great read. And then there is a collection of essays here, Alaska at War. This one is edited by Fern Chandonnet. The Forgotten War Remembered. Is really good stuff. Good reading if you're interested in exploring this any further. And I've gone 4 minutes over my allotted hour, so I'm going to thank you very much for your attention and for your interest in the topic tonight, and I'm going to close out. Any questions?
Well, John, we're going to let Teresa talk real fast on, not real fast, but for a few minutes on our own Coast Guard Cutter McLean's role in this incredible things that happened in Alaska. Because we have this vessel here that sits in our channel that unfortunately seems to get overshadowed by the submarine. But she has such an incredible history. So if you don't mind hanging out for a few more minutes while Teresa tells us about our own Coast Guard Cutter McLean.
Hi, I'm Teresa.
I'm good to go.
I'll just speak from the back. I'll try not to take too much of your time, and I don't think I'm quite as knowledgeable as Professor Heaton, but one of the things that we like to do at this museum is to tell the experience of World War II through the experience of the individuals. So for just a few minutes tonight, we're going to go through the experiences of some of the experiences of one individual vessel in Alaska in World War II. To start that, though, I did have to go a little bit before World War II, just to kind of get you to know the McLean a little bit, who will be celebrating her 95th birthday on Wednesday. So she's a boat, I kind of refer to her as our Johnny Cash boat. She's been everywhere. We're only going to work on a couple of parts of it right here. As you know, Peggy said we have a submarine. Everybody knows that. You know we have a building, or you'd be sitting outside the cold right now. But we don't spend as much time talking about our U.S. Coast Guard Cutter McLean. She was built in 1927 at a cost of about $63,000, which is just over $1 million in today's money. She's 24 feet wide and 125 feet long, which earned her and others of that size the nickname Buck and a Quarter. She was named for Lewis McLean, who served in a couple of different presidential administrations with Jackson, with Polk, was in the Navy, all that stuff. 1927 was the year that McLean was started. That was the year of the jazz singer, Joseph Stalin, the Holland Tunnel, Spirit of St. Louis, CBS Radio, Mount Rushmore was started, and Prohibition started. The Volstead Act, or the 18th Amendment, made it illegal to produce, transport, or sell alcohol in the United States. The Coast Guard was tasked with stopping this smuggling. There were about 5,000 miles of coastline, and when you added the inland creeks, bays, Great Lakes, etc., they had about 35,000 miles to patrol, and the Coast Guard started with 55 vessels to do all that patrolling. Ships like the McLean were built to intercept the smugglers and confiscate and destroy the contact boats and their cargo. And because of that, they were given the nickname rum chasers. But it turned out they weren't able to do a whole lot of chasing. The ideas on the planning board and the drawing board didn't quite turn out to be the way the ships were constructed. They originally planned that she'd be able to go about 15 knots, but once it was all said and done, she could only go about 10.5 knots. So therefore, with the slow speed, they worked more on deterrence than actual chasing them down. Radar was not yet available to help them with this. There was no GPS or anything like that, but they did have two of these handy dandy guns. And if that wasn't enough to scare off the smugglers, they also equipped her with a big spotlight. So that sent all the criminals running, I'm sure. But despite all the challenges of area and not much equipment to go with, the Coast Guard did intercept and confiscate quite a few illegal rum runs. And on December 5th, 1933, due to unpopular demand, prohibition was out of here. So people could drink again, and people might have thought maybe the McLean was going to be out of a job. I mean, when they eliminated what you do for a living, what will you do? So over the next few years, McLean was used as a test bed and working model for the rest of the fleet for new ideas and equipment. She underwent a variety of refits between patrols, trying to increase her stability and trying to increase her speed. But they said, a displacement hull rather than a planing hull, you're only going to get so much speed out of that. So she was never really a fast boat. And even as late as the 1920s, many of the traditionalists thought that a ship was not a ship unless it had sails. So even though McLean was always diesel powered when she was built, she and her sister ships were twin-masted and equipped with an auxiliary sail rig. They were originally equipped with 2 masts. The decision to refit to 1 was a little controversial as it added even more to the boat's instability. And these vessels, this line was often described as the wettest, roughest riding vessels the crew had ever served on. So they were not happy. And then World War II. In 1939, World War II was breaking out in Europe. In anticipation of U.S. involvement, FDR signed Executive Order number 8929 on November 1st, 1941, directing the Coast Guard, including McLean, to operate as part of the Navy. She was renamed USS McLean. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor changed the country and the world. The first radio communication to McLean was, hostilities with Japan commenced with air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. The second message that she got was U.S. at war with Japan. Maintain darkened ship at night and take necessary precautions. At the time, she was off the coast of El Salvador. McLean was transferred to the 17th Naval District in Alaska, where she patrolled Chatham Strait. She was stationed in Ketchikan from 1941 to 1945. She came to Alaska for World War II with just the 30 caliber machine guns. Her spotlight, along with a lot of other U.S. military goodies, had been given to other countries as part of the Lend-Lease program. So to be effective in the war, she went to Seattle to get a few more armaments. But with the weaponry also came more weight. She did get the depth charges, but she had to make sure that even with her blazing speed, she gave herself enough of a head start so she didn't get caught in her own blast. So, as if they didn't have enough to worry about. Tim Taylor, though, would have been happy with all that stuff, I'm sure, right? Her principal assignment was the Dixon entrance. She did surveillance, sonar search for submarines at all times, and alternate sweeps by echo ranging and listening. The watches were typically 4 on, 8 off. Every day there was quarters for muster, drills and instruction, lowering boat, anchoring, calls to battle station. The patrol schedule was 10 days out and 10 in. The time spent reaching the patrol spot and back were included in the in-port time. As the war went on, there was less time in port, frequent canceling of liberty, and often they were underway on short notice for sub-sightings, rescue missions, or whatever other duties as assigned were needed. Some records show that there were as many as 50 people on board during World War II. During that time, the main berth had 7 tiers of bunks, all 3 or 4 high, kind of like it is now. During her duties in Alaska, all of the portholes were removed to provide for a warmer ship. I think later in her career, she kind of missed having those portholes. But that's a story for another day. You'll have to come back and hear that one. One event that is frequently discussed among some McLean crew members, or at least we found it in our archives, mentioned a couple of times, was called the Bell Chase incident. While McLean was patrolling the Bering Sea, she encountered a vessel stacked just above the horizon. She knew there weren't any Allied vessel movements scheduled there, so McLean went to battle stations and increased to her full speed, as fast as she could go, to investigate. When approaching the unidentified vessel, contact is made through searchlights. The unidentified vessel challenged McLean, and she replied with the code for the other ship to stand down. But the only problem is, McLean's searchlight is not there anymore. It had been donated. So all McLean had was a little oil burning lamp. The other vessel couldn't see the lamp and just kept coming at her, charging at full speed with their battle stations ready. When they approached and both captains realized finally they were on the same side, The captain from the identified Canadian minesweeper said, I wish I had a Canadian accent, but I would just sound insensitive. So I say, Captain, where is your signal searchlight? The McLean's captain, Ralph Burns, replied, we gave them all to the damn Canadians. So both ships secured from battle stations and went their separate ways. In another incident, there was a submarine sighted by a fishing boat. An aircraft was set out to investigate, and after about an hour's search with nothing and they were ready to go home, the sub surfaced again. McLean reached the spot later that day and did the prescribed search pattern while listening and echo ranging. She was joined by the foremost, a halibut schooner that was converted into a patrol boat. Because if you catch fish, you can be in a war, right? The submarine fired a torpedo, which actually helped the Coast Guard track where the submarine was. McLean dropped her depth charges. Oil was seen on the surface. Several more boats participated in the search, but after that, there were no more sightings or soundings of that submarine. Of course, even in the middle of the war, she is still a Coast Guard vessel and is still called upon for search and rescue services. In 1944, she assisted the U.S. Army tug that was in distress in the Chatham Strait. And in October 44, she rescued 3 survivors from a disabled fishing vessel. Maybe that's what they do on their not on wartime duty. That's their off time, right? But one of the greatest events that McLean was involved in at that time was the Gillum plane crash. Harold Gillum was employed by a construction firm and was assigned to transport 5 passengers to Anchorage. The little plane encountered severe weather and engine failure, so Gillum had to put the plane down on a clearing in the forest. Unfortunately, he missed that clearing and crash landed. Amazingly, though, all the passengers did survive the crash. 2 days later, one of the women did die of blood loss. The pilot, or Gillum, who decided he had to try to help despite a severe head injury, decided to venture out in search of help. He did not make it and died 7 miles from the crash site. 2 of the other survivors who were not injured in the crash decided it was up to them to go for help. They left the 2 who had multiple broken bones behind and set out. They were picked up by a Coast Guard reserve vessel and were able to give directions to the crash site. There was a large-scale rescue effort organized, and due to a lack of manpower, 6 of McLean's crew members volunteered or were volunteered. They didn't really clear that up in the memories we have written in our archives. I think some of them were a little more happy to volunteer than others. Because this involved hiking through the mountains of Alaska in the cold weather with deep snow in gear that's designed for service on a boat. But thanks to their hard work of the Alaska Territorial Guardsmen and the Coast Guard, 4 survivors were plucked from the Alaskan wilderness 3 weeks after the crash and brought safely home. McLean had a very outstanding war service in World War II. Even though we don't generally think of the Coast Guard as being a war vessel, she was awarded several medals. And she did get her 1 flag, her 1 decal for sinking that Japanese submarine, which is very unusual for a Coast Guard cutter. And that is the end of her service in World War II. She went on to have a much longer career doing search and rescue in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm thinking when she was coming out down in the Gulf of Mexico, she really missed those portholes. But, you know, she went on anyway to have a very long career and eventually end up here. And one of these days, you'll have to come out and hear her whole story and take a good walk through the McLean. So that gives you a little idea of just the experiences of 1 crew of 1 vessel for some of the experiences they would have had in Alaska. And now I will return it back to Professor Heaton in case you have questions. Because
And Tom has the microphone, so please use the microphone so our guests at home can hear well. Do we have any questions for either Teresa or Professor Heaton?
Oh, pick him, pick him.
Professor,
Yes.
I saw a documentary on Attu, and apparently after the war, I mean, recently, they put some memorial items for the Japanese on Attu, which was very controversial to the veterans. Can you comment on that? Do you know anything about that? Who authorized that? How it happened?
I haven't heard about that. No, sorry, I can't comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Hey, maybe I should say this before too many questions are asked. I came at this interest in World War II in Alaska accidentally. A few years ago, I was in the National Archives of Washington, D.C., and I was there studying an Alaska Native economic topic. And while I was waiting for my files to get pulled, I was thumbing through a guide on Alaska documents in the National Archives, and I found a reference to Al Jolson's USO trip to Alaska just days after the attack on Dutch Harbor. And he wrote about an 11-page, 12-page report about this. And so I mentioned that because I saw that reference to the jazz singer and Al Jolson. And I didn't have time to talk about him. He spends about a week and a half flying around to various locations and entertaining the troops. And that's how I got interested in this. So I am by no means an expert on World War II in Alaska as well. Maybe you guys know more about stuff like Attu than I do, but I will do the best I can to answer any questions you might have.
Could you share the name of that book again? 1,000 Mile Battle? Or?
Yeah. I'll hold it up here. Maybe you can see it. The 1,000 Mile War by Brian Garfield. It's a great book. I am an academic, and don't tell anybody, but sometimes the books that academics write can be kind of dry. This is not dry. This is a great book. It's a page turner. It will keep your interest.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do we have any other questions?
I've been to your museum there because my dad served on the McLean during World War II, and I was really impressed with how well things were done there. It really enjoyed being there and standing on the ship, the same ship that my dad was on during World War II. Although he was a cook, so I don't know where that fits into the scheme of winning wars.
Troops got to eat. Sailors got to eat.
Well, thank you for saying that.
The military travels on its stomach, right?
Thank you for saying that. We truly appreciate that. And we love our McLean, and we'll be singing happy birthday to her very shortly. 95 years and going strong.
Just like Johnny Cash. She's been everywhere.
I'll tell you one other short one about the McLeans. It's kind of quiet there. It was stationed, I think, in Aberdeen, Washington for a while. And it came down to a little town on the Oregon coast called Depot Bay, where they have this celebration of the Fleet of Flowers. And so the boats would come out and they went around the McLean, and then they throw these flowers off commemorating people who've lost their lives at sea. And I didn't know if my dad was going to stay on board the boat that was going around the McLean or not, because he was so excited to see the old ship that he was on. Great experience.
Hey, Cliff, Tom Trenner here. I was just curious how they got the McLean into Depot Bay there, because that's I see pictures of 47s going in there, and they're squeezing both sides.
But it didn't come into the harbor. It was out about
Oh, okay.
out about the Bell Buoy, and the other ships would came out and went around it. No, it couldn't make it in there.
We have a question that just came in on chat.
Attacks on the Kuriil Islands were launched from the Aleutians.
So the question, Teresa will read the question.
The question for those of you in the audience, I don't know if the professor can see it. Were any attacks against Japan launched from Alaska territory?
Just on the Kuriil Islands.
If anybody else on Zoom has a question, you can type it in and we can read it, or you can unmute yourself and ask it out loud.
I'm going to say another thing. I'm sorry, but I just heard yesterday that Japan and Russia are still in quote unquote a state of war because over the Kuril Islands, because they've never been able to resolve who owns them, and Japan will not back down.
Yeah, I noticed that in the news recently too. So I'm curious how that's going to get resolved.
It won't.
Yeah, I read just recently about how ill-equipped our guys were on Attu. I think they may have taken a group from Africa, but they did not have proper gear, weren't really prepared for the wet lowland that they, had to trudge through. And then on the other island, they finally sent the 10th Mountain Division for the second go around, who had a lot more experience in bad weather warfare. And I guess they were in such foggy conditions, and they were so afraid of the Japanese who weren't there, that they were shooting each other in the fog, because they could not tell. And in the nighttime, they would hear noises, and several hundred of them, as you mentioned, were killed from friendly fire because they were so afraid of the Japanese who didn't exist there anymore.
Yeah, no doubt they knew about what had happened at Attu. The Kastner Cutthroat group, that commando group, they had written a manual to try to help the military prepare for these battles, so that the soldiers would have the right gear, the right cold weather gear, and they just military. What was it that Donald Rumsfeld famously said? You go to war with the military that you have, and not the one that you want. So anyway, that was part of the blunder, and hopefully that was, I assume that was part of the lesson that was learned after they studied the Aleutian campaign in preparation for island hopping in the South Pacific.
Tom Trenner here again. Dad was in 7th Infantry Division, World War II, and they came together as a unit out in the Mojave Desert for training there. Supposedly they were going to go to North Africa. That got over before their training evidently, or whatever happened, but they got assigned up then to the Aleutians. They looked around, found a unit that was available, that had conducted training. They didn't realize that necessarily that was desert instead of Arctic. But they loaded a lot of stuff on ships out of California, and it was all lightweight stuff that they had, no fall weather gear.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I would especially like to thank our two wonderful speakers tonight. Dr. Heaton, I have learned so much about the war in Alaska recently, and your presentation was just wonderful. And Teresa, for bringing our own history of the plane to us and putting it into context. Because so often, you talk to people about Alaska during World War II, and they're like, it happened in Alaska. I'm like, yes, a lot happened in Alaska. And bringing that knowledge to everyone is so important. So I thank you both for doing this. And we look forward to seeing everyone here next week when we'll be talking about the Seabees' role in the Pacific. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.